We're also very interested in diversity and complexity. So realist evaluation doesn't just ask what works, but for whom, when, in which contexts and ways and why. So it's very much diverse. We're very concerned with causal mechanisms and outcomes, and also in structures and agents. And we look at very varied, diverse experiences and contexts and people's interpretive views. We also work across methods. Critical realism can apply to almost any research method, macro or micro, quantitative and qualitative. And I suggest we're also very interested in public sociology. In fact, scientific realism has a better record than many kinds of sociology in getting into the public domain, influencing policy. Next slide, please. There are some differences, though, which we'll look at today. Realist evaluation is mainly concerned with research methods. And also, although Ray Pawson says that you start from theories, theories are mainly taken to mean hypotheses. Critical realism's main concern is with theories, not with methods. It's a philosophy of the natural and social sciences. One realist evaluator said to me, "Oh, I don't have time for theories." But of course, that sentence is a theory in itself. We can't escape from theories. And the critical realist argues that the most practical way to start a research project is to analyse your theories. Be aware of them because they have great power over how they shape your questions and replies. And we can look at the long history of sexist and racist sociology, stretching back centuries, can't we? With people unaware of their theories that men are superior or white people are superior. And that illustrates the huge importance of critically analysing our assumptions. There are also differences which we'll look at later about time, agency and values. Next slide, please. Critical realism emphasises the 3 levels of reality. So, for example, in physics with falling rain, there's the empirical level, our impressions and images of many falling objects. There's the actual level. Specific numbers of objects fall in regular or irregular patterns or in constant conjunctions. So might the patterns reveal the cause of the falling? Now this applies to enormous amounts of data collected and organised in with variables and so on to see how the patterns, the constant conjunctions can explain what's going on. But critical realism argues that we can't look at that level for causal explanations. Many causes are unseen, and that's a problem with scientific realism if there's an insistence on evidence sensed through the 5 senses empirically, because the causal mechanisms in physics, for example, here with rain, are gravity and hydrologic cycles. And gravity itself is a huge problem. We can't see it, prove it. It's an idea, isn't it? So far it's worked, but one day somebody might find out the problem with it. So it's definitely a theory or a causal mechanism. Critical realism talks about causal mechanisms, not causes, because usually there are so many causes involved, all interrelating, that there's not one single cause usually. Next slide, please. The 3-tier reality is so useful for interdisciplinary research. So we've seen in physics. Now look at biochemistry and diabetes, for example. At the empirical level, people with diabetes have hypers when they feel hyperactive and hypos when they feel weak and faint. At the actual level, their blood sugar levels rise during hypers and fall during hypos. At the real level, the pancreas fails to secrete the hormone insulin that turns sugar into energy. And that amazing discovery early last century has saved countless lives. Next slide, please. And this applies the 3 levels to social research on diabetes. So at the empirical level, we interview and do surveys about the experiences and views of people with diabetes. At the actual level, we can observe their daily life, their interactions and events, the effects on and of their diabetes in their lives, the numbers of people affected, their healthcare needs, services, costs of diabetes care. All these are actual handleable phenomena that we can collect data about. At the third real level, their daily life with diabetes is influenced by often unseen, perhaps remote influences, class, income, ethnicity, the political economy. For example, millions of people in the United States cannot afford to buy insulin in their private healthcare services. So the types of healthcare services are extremely important for the health of people with diabetes, their personal decisions. And then there are the pressures from the big food industry, the junk food, the way obesity levels are massively rising and are predicted to rise phenomenally across the world due to these great pressures of advertising and fashion and peer culture, which is so important in people's everyday lives as causal influences. Next slide, please. Thanks. Now, the 3 levels also involve time sequence in critical realism. So the empirical experiences, our views, our analysis, when we sense something going on, we wonder what it is and think about it. We then imagine you're a person with diabetes and you're getting a hyper. Then we look at the actual, what's actually going on, the natural and social structures and events in our lives. And then, because these things are happening, we think, why? What's making this happen? And we look underneath at the real, mainly unseen causal mechanisms. Now, many people may not get that far. They're so busy coping with the actual. In contrast, I would argue that scientific realism emphasizes events. And so at the empirical level, there are data, statistics, analysis in research. And these look at the actual evidence, the actual variables, the context, mechanisms, and outcomes. But whether we agree or not, I'm suggesting that scientific realism looks much less at the underlying causal mechanisms. Next slide, please. Forson and Tilley argued that realists shun the successionist or sequence through time view of causation as a relationship between discrete events. They see causal powers embedded timelessly in social relations and organizational structures which they form. And these occur through constant reaction. So when we look at any moment in society, so much is going on all the time, interrelating, that there's a strong argument for this. However, critical realists would argue that as well as this open system of countless causal influences and effects and outcomes interacting, they still are all occurring in time sequences. So that in diabetes, for example, the sugar level falls because of the inaction of the pancreas, and therefore these other outcomes are happening. And the fall or the loss of insulin was prior to the fall of sugar levels. Next slide, please. So I've raised lots of questions, and I thought it would be worthwhile discussing the 3 levels of reality first before we go any further. So would people like to add comments and questions?
Yeah, if people can put some comments in the chat, then we can come to that. I've just been trying to search, because you touched on one of your early slides, Priscilla, about theory and how theory is used in realist research. If anyone knows the paper that I'm talking about, can you put it in the chat? I read a really useful paper years ago around the different types of theory, because that really messed with my head. The fact that you can have program theory, mid-range theory, grand theory, and meta theory, and to me they were all the same thing. And there was a really good paper a number of years ago that had outlined how you can understand the different types of theory. And I think that is probably a really useful. It took me a really long time to understand how program theory, like we use in scientific realism research, can differ from a mid-range theory. And then obviously people then talk about grand theory and meta theory. And I found the whole thing really confusing. So if anyone knows the paper that I'm talking about, can stick it in the chat. Maybe we've all stumbled across this paper, but it was quite useful for me to help, because I think that's a big issue, is how we define things in the different areas. I think there's a particular concern. Has anyone got any conversations or comments at the moment? Okay, so we've got, so Verity's put a paper in. I'll check that and see if it's the same one that I was looking at, and I'll put it in the chat if it is. And then we've got Tom who's asked a question. Tom, do you want to come on and ask your question?
I don't mind, but yeah, it was a bit confusing for me, but I'm not so used with realism, only for 1.5 years, 2 years that I'm busy working on it. But that in the examples that were given, that when you had the difference between the actual, the real, that the examples in the real were for me context factors and not something from the real. For me, the real is the mechanisms that you can't really put your finger on, that you can give a name, like you also said. But if you saw the examples, it was context. It was, yeah.
Thank you. That's really useful. Thank you. First of all, to critical realists, the real, what makes it real is that it causes and has effect. And that the actual and the empirical are all effects secondary to the prior real that caused them.
Can you give an example of that, Priscilla? Like, have you got like an articulated example?
Yes, to go back to the rain,
yeah.
Without gravity, we wouldn't have rain falling, would we?
No.
So we wouldn't have the actual raindrops falling, or our empirical experience of being terribly happy to see our gardens being rained on, or terribly miserable to see the rain ruining our wedding day.
But I agree, but when you went to the sociological examples, then you gave examples of like social structures, etc., as the real. So for me, that's also something you could empirically measure, social things, but it's the mechanisms that work in that social structure, maybe not, but that if you understand what I mean, yeah, in that way it was a bit confusing.
Sorry. Well, first of all, although I'm saying the real is unseen, it's not. I should have said usually unseen to the naked eye, because of course lots of research has found we can see the virus that caused the pandemic, for example, can't we, nowadays? On the other hand, in a way, viruses are invisible, usually, aren't they? Now, how could we possibly understand the COVID-19 pandemic if we only looked at people getting ill, all the masses of social, political, economic activity that followed and changed the whole world, but all of it was caused by this unseen virus. And unless we identify the original cause, we don't have a hope of, one, understanding, and two, seriously altering, preventing, changing the problems that it causes.
Does that help, Tom?
Yeah, thank you.
I can see Ray's put his camera on. Did you want to say something, Ray? As I suppose
I was going to fire on the 3 levels of reality, the little matrix. Could we put it up again?
Karen, are you able to do that? Just give it a second, Ray. We'll just upload the presentation.
Which one did you want? Because there are about 4 versions.
Bhaskar's one. The
one with Ray.
Okay, let's have a try with that. That you've presented that as a matter of ontology. So things only become real when all of those 3 things are in place. I think that's not about ontology at all, but causality. So you can only understand causality when you know about those 3 things. So I think you're confusing reality with causality, ontology with causality.
Thank you. That's such an important point. Because it's called critical realism, it's very much concerned with reality and restoring ontology to the centre of our understanding. Another challenging thing about critical realism, which I think many people find very, very helpful, is that the epistemology and ontology, the Greek words, tend to be extremely mysterious and people get very confused and avoid them, whereas critical realists argue that until we understand epistemology and ontology and the difference between them, our theories will not be clarified. And to take epistemology as basically as thinking and talking, and ontology as being and doing. So in that little model, there's being and doing at all levels, because thinking and talking, of course, are being and doing. They're a subset of it. But the real being and doing is in the gravity, the pull of gravity, and in the actual raindrops and objects and events. Whereas the epistemology is up at the top in the empirical. So although it is, of course, about causation, it is also about the nature of all ontology.
Sorry, I was actually just trying to process that. I was quite deep in thought trying to understand that. So if we were to try and apply that to, I mean, maybe Ray can potentially help with this as well, because obviously we've got 2 people and we're very fortunate, 2 people in 2 separate disciplines. If we're looking at this, because I think the majority of the people here today would be, are scientific realists who follow this group, and we're trying to be able to understand the differences, and I know that it's underpinned by the philosophies of critical realism, and it's trying to understand where those differences begin and end. How does scientific realism, Ray, respond to the critical realist view that Priscilla's just explained, just to help the people in the group?
Well, I think there are other interesting differences which will no doubt arise. But in simple terms, I would say that all of those 3 levels are real. So if events are real, when I phone for an appointment at the doctor and can't get one for 3 weeks, that's real. And the frustration that I experience on hearing that, that's real. So for me, all of those are real. Where I agree with Priscilla is the first two don't constitute causal explanation, but I don't think that's anything to do with ontology.
Thank you so much, Ray, because by labelling the third level real, I imply the others are not, and that's a big mistake, because in critical realism they are all levels of reality. It's just that there's the idea that the deepest real level is the most real, and I think a lot of people would say at the top level is empirical. Of course, all our thoughts are real, all our beliefs are real, and they often guide our actions as well. However, they're not, you could say they're not quite as powerfully real as the causal real. But the other thing about epistemology and so on, is that often my students say, well, where would you put, for example, a surgical ward? And we used to have arguments about whether it was a sort of an event or what it was. Anyway, what I've come to think of is that nearly everything actually moves up and down between the three levels. So that, for example, a surgical ward is real in the minds of the patients and staff and how it is affecting their perceptions and experiences. A surgical ward is real because it is an actual structure and it houses events and outcomes as well. And a surgical ward is real in that it is causal. Without it, all the surgery that happens wouldn't be able to happen, so that it generates outcomes. It's an actual sort of empty shell. Oh, I'll go on to our structure and agency later about, sorry, that's another thing. So I hope you agree that things go through sort of tiers of reality, so that there's sort of a deeper and more powerful reality, but all of them, I agree with Ray, all of them are real ontology.
Okay, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Sarah Van Bell has asked, I don't know if you're here, Sarah, if you want to just come on and ask your question. If not, I'll ask it for you.
I'm in a library.
I can ask it for you then, and you can
I'll do it very quietly. No, it's about time to explain to me the difference between timeless and then the view of critical realism on time. Again, sorry, because I didn't get that last bit.
Do you want the slide again, Priscilla?
Yes, if you like. Maybe Ray would like to say something in a minute. I'll just quickly say that the time sequence of the cause of gravity and the rain system happens so that the moisture goes up and floats around in clouds and then goes down with the pull of gravity, and then we experience the rain. But without the gravity and the rain system, we couldn't possibly have this cycle of water and then our experiences of it. But maybe Ray would like to comment on my quote.
I think this is your show, Priscilla, and I'm just glad to happy to be in the audience. In terms of time, I would have thought that what you're calling scientific realism dealt with that all of the time. All programs have long implementation chains. They're repeated over and over again. They have intended and unintended consequences. So there's a constant movement over time in all policy.
Does that help, Sarah? You can just click yes in the chat or no if you want. Okay, I think what we'll do is, Priscilla, we'll move on and then we can come back to all of these questions later because we've still got a few. And I think we're going to run out of time for the other things. So if it's all right, we'll move on to the next phase.
Yeah, should we have the next slide? Thank you. Right, agents and structures. So critical realists have identified 4 approaches to structure and agency. And in the first, there are strong structures and weaker agents. So a lot of research on, for instance, variables that groups people according to income, education and so on, implies that our lives are very much governed by the structures around us, social, political, economic, physical. And that's very true in many ways. The second, and this tends to be interpretive research, that qualitative research and in-depth interviews with people can often imply that there are quite strong agents with the background of structures on which they draw and they organise, and the agents are very much in charge of their lives. The third, which it blends structure and agency, and in some examples of scientific realism, where there are contexts and mechanisms, it's not clear when the individual people are doing things and when the structures and contexts and mechanisms are the powerful. So there's a sort of mixture. With critical realism, and especially the work of Margaret Archer, for example, there's a clear, strong distinction between all inanimate structures, things, events, and conscious human agency. And there's the dialectic between them. Next slide, please. So they're not seen as dichotomies as much as interacting, dialectical, completely distinct and different, but constantly interacting, interchanging entities. Now, if you, in research that's not very clear about structure and agency and who's doing what, and one example is actor network theory, you could say it's a bit like salty water. The salt and the water don't keep their distinct properties, they lose them. Whereas critical realism is very keen to make sure that the agents are distinct from the structures. Do rivers shape landscapes or landscapes shape rivers? Well, they constantly interact, don't they? But like structures, the landscape tends to be more static, and the river, like agency, is fluid. We're constantly flowing through our landscapes. We are shaped and reshaped by our structures, and they reshape the structures, and we reshape structures through constant social processes in the dialectic of time and space. Next slide, please. Margaret Archer talks about structure, agency, and culture, and the interactions that shape human life and society. So structures precede and outlast agents, like patients coming into the hospital, for example. But structures are only enacted through human agency. They are set up and maintained. They're empty shell buildings unless agents come in and turn them into places of healing. All of them are distinct and irreducible. We can't collapse agents into structures or structures into agents. In continuous interaction and social change at all levels of social reality. Margaret Archer calls it morphogenesis, when agents change structures, resist them, crash them, start them. And she calls it morphostasis, when agents confirm the structures, maybe strengthen them, go along with them. Next slide, please. Structures are determining, hugely influential, but not determinist. That means they haven't got the final say, because they compete in open systems of many forces, and both realisms are keen on open systems, the complexity of life. So critical realism sees agency as neither voluntarism, we're completely free to do what we want, or determinism, we're completely constrained and controlled by our structures, but see the dialectic between our freedom and our constraints. Agency involves meaningful causal power, informed by self-aware human intention and purpose, orientated to and evaluated by future effects. All our actions are orientated to some future. And Archer book on internal conversations is very interesting in how she sees agents and structures and the interaction between them. Of course, our agency is very limited. Echoing Marx, we live in conditions not of our own choosing. We are thrown into context, like when we're born, when we go to school or university, when we join an online group. Our actions can have unintended, counterproductive, unwanted, unpredicted effects. So our agency is very limited in these ways. And often choices may be limited to the least harmful choice. When I interview children and parents waiting for the child's heart operation, of course they don't want to have the heart operation. It's very drastic, terrifying and life-threatening. But they come to the decision that they look at all the options, including not having it and going on with the heart problem. And so they choose surgery as the least harmful choice. It's not really a greatly wanted, and yet it is desperately wanted. So choices are very complicated. Next slide, please. Sam Porter has suggested that maybe it would be worth adding agency to CMOs, having CMAOs, to make clear the differences between conscious agent psyches, their choices and capacities, versus the inanimate resources, structures, contexts, and social mechanisms. So shall we discuss these questions now? I hope I've come across how powerfully critical realism is concerned with both our enormous strengths and potential and our great weaknesses as well.
Sorry, I just couldn't get mic off there. So if anyone has any questions for this part of the conversation, then please pop them in the chat. I will say that there's an excellent series of papers, which I think we call the Porter-Pawson debate, which he's laughing, which are worth a review. And if you've got a local group, they're certainly worth discussing in a journal club format. They're really enlightening, and I found them really helpful early on, even if I was still getting tied up in what was a context, what was a mechanism, and what was an outcome at that point. But I will say they are worth reviewing, and they're very easily available. You can Google them. So does anyone have anything here? So we've got Fern first. So Fern, if you want to come on and ask your question, you can, or I can ask it for you. As we've got silence, I will ask it. So in scientific realism, doesn't agency come under mechanisms within the 4 contextual layers?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Fern, for clarifying this. But as I hope I've explained, conscious human agency is so entirely different from inanimate structures and things that we would argue it needs to be recognised and made very clear whether it's the conscious agents or the powerful political economic structures, whether it's the river or the landscape, the earth, that is doing the moving and changing.
I hope that answers your question, Fern. Kate, I'm going to move on to yours now. We've got, do you want to ask it? No? Do you want to say it? It just feels like a statement, so I can't work out what the actual question is.
Sorry, it's because I can't see what I'm typing in the chat. I have to type short. I don't know why, but I'm just hoping it comes out right. No, it's just when you said thrownness, and I was thinking about phenomenology and Heidegger and the relationship between phenomenology and critical realism. I just wonder if you could say something about that.
Yes, the thrownness, I think. Oh, yes, it does come from Heidegger. Sorry, doesn't it? Yes, I agree. Would you like to say something?
Well, only that I'm interested in it. I have been reading Margaret Archer. So I'm supposed to be doing scientific realism, but I'm drawn to critical realism. So I'm in your camp, and your book's my favourite book. I just like to get that in. I'm a fan. So I've been thinking about this idea of, people's lived experience. They're thrown into this world. So, you know, phenomenology, the lived experience of people thrown into a world that they didn't choose. And then sort of phenomenology seems to sort of stop. And I would say that critical realism is like the net. We can work those two philosophies together to come up with something far richer and deeper. I mean, that's what I'm thinking, but I don't know if anyone else thinks that, or if I'm on the right track.
That sounds brilliant.
Great. I'll carry on.
So, Ray, you've got your hand up. I'll come in and see if it helps to explain anything that you want to mention.
Okay. I think.
I'm struggling with your mic, Ray. There's a lot of feedback on it.
Any better?
There's a lot of background feedback on it. Yeah, a lot of background noise. That's it. It's gone. It's gone. Yeah, it's gone.
Not guilty.
No idea. It's the tech gremlins, obviously.
In terms of the duality of structure and agency, the zigzag between a structure and agency, I can comfortably agree with that. In terms of the Pawson and Porter debate, they are a good read. You should think of it as two old dinosaurs battling their heads against each other, and so its textual qualities alone make it worth reading. Where I disagree with Priscilla is I think lots of critical realism is in the strong structure, weak agency camp. And poor me, I read Bhaskar's The Possibility of Naturalism in depth many years ago, and it's strong structures, weak agencies. There's always a tendency, I think, in critical realism. Bhaskar actually calls it transcendental realism in that particular book, because of a preference for these huge structures like capitalism, patriarchy. I think of another, Raymond. Anyway, that will do. And Bhaskar's book is that particular book is Marxist, pure and simple, and I think it's in that camp, strong structure, rather weak agency.
That's so useful, Ray, because you've made me realise that I think we're talking about weak in two meanings. Also, by the way, that book of Roy's was quite early on, and I think he was very much influenced by Margaret Archer and other sociologists over the decades. And his most recent book, written by his colleague Mervyn after Roy died, came out in, I think, 2016 or 17, Enlightened Common Sense, and it sums up much more clearly often all his decades of thought, and is really the book I'd recommend. Now, the two weak meanings, I think, of agents are: one, we are tiny, insignificant, microscopic in the universe. So we're definitely weak, and we're surrounded by mega powerful, historic, profound structures such as the political economy and countless others. We're outnumbered by them by far. So we're very relatively weak there. However, human beings have the cheek to say that we are amazing, as far as we know at the moment, we're the most highly self-aware, conscious, intentional beings ever, for better or worse. And because of that, we're because of that, tiny and insignificant as we are enormously powerful. We are causing climate chaos, aren't we? We are causing biodiversity loss. We have massive power because of our blessing or our curse of this amazing scientific insights and understanding and ability to carry out and coordinate across the whole world, for better or worse. So would you agree there are these two different meanings of weak, a relative one and then a kind of specific one, and that when we talk about structure and agency in our research, we need to respect the enormous power and strengths of our conscious agency as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's just collective agency. So that's fine. I still get this impression that critical realists want to be critical on the basis of some assumption about transcendental powers. The one I forgot was post-colonialism, and Bhaskar himself switched from Marxism to spiritualism as this guiding overriding force. So we agree to disagree on that one.
Yeah, well, I agree with quite a lot of what you said. But first of all, I don't do Bhaskar's third stage of spiritualism because I just find basic critical realism and dialectical critical realism, his second stage, are just so useful that I stick with them. So we're agreed there. And secondly, when you say it's just collective agency, our human part, well, there are many more ants in the world than humans. And ants work amazingly on collective agency, but we've had hugely more impact on them because of our unique, strong human capacities, surely.
Yes.
I'm just going to come in here because we're going to have to move on, but I've just had a thought. If I was watching this really early in my PhD journey, I would be completely lost at this point. So for people who are watching this in the recording who've had no previous knowledge, there's a few people sticking their hands up. Can we have some recommendations in the chat for really easy to understand papers, books? Like I just mentioned the Porter-Pawson debate. I read that early on and it really helped. What have people done to help them understand the difference between structure and agency, capacity? I could certainly get some laughs from all of you over the follies and random rabbit holes that I've been down in my life. I found Roy Bhaskar's work, for me at the time, I haven't visited recently, but I found it impenetrable. I found it really difficult. I don't have a sociological background, and I know there are lots of people out there like me who need like an easy introduction to some of this to help them follow these talks. So please fill the chat and we will try and see if we can get a good resource to go alongside this at the end of this. We'll try and see if we can put an extra slide up towards the end of this presentation. So thanks for that, Priscilla. Shall we move on? Because we've just got half an hour left.
Can I just recommend Douglas Popora's book, 2015, I think Reconstructing Sociology or something, very clear on introduction to critical realism.
If someone can find that and stick a link in the chat or something, that would also help us out. But yeah, we will try and pull these together. Yeah, I have to agree. I agree. Freddie Muck and Banks good paper as well. Sorry, Ray, I think you were going to say something.
And watch the screen.
I've lost you.
Have you got me back?
Yeah, you're back. Yeah.
The structure and agency debate goes back years, well before Archer. And I first came across it in something called Coleman's Boat. James Coleman's Boat. If you Google up Coleman's Boat, you'll find a lovely introduction to the zigzag between structure and agency.
Thank you, because I think there is a tendency for us, especially those like me. I did a brain imaging master's and I came over to this from a very, very different world altogether. And for me, a structure is a building, it's a real thing. And to, first of all, you need to change how you think about these things. And I think we sometimes we need to start there, and we need to acknowledge that some of the people who are joining these groups are at that starting point as I was 10 years ago. So I think, thank you very much for that, Ray. Shall we move on, Priscilla, to the next bit? Thank you.
Values. So again, I've quoted Ray, and by the way, I've summarised your very fascinating debate with Sam Porter in my book, Ray. I found it extremely useful. And you say that value freedom is essential if evaluation science is not to abandon analysis for ideology, which is the basic error of critical realism. To which critical realists would reply that we can do analysis and have ideology. Health and society are value-laden. And so an accurate analysis takes account of this. Society is very unequal, isn't it? Getting more so every year, it seems. So if we try to have a neutral sociology that ignores that, it's going to reflect what it collects. It's going to be tipped up. A sociology that does not adjust is also going to be unequal. There was an example of health visitor research and effectiveness. And first of all, the idea of effectiveness needs to be questioned, because very often it means cost effectiveness, but this can be completely different from people effectiveness. How does it actually help the people in need? There's also the frequent use of the term stakeholders, but that implies that everyone is equal and all the stakes are equal. But whose stakes? And how do the stakes affect research and practice? For example, in the health visitor research, the worry of the health visitors was that they would miss abusive parents and then get into terrific trouble for it. And it might cost them their career, so their stakes were high. However, the parents were in a double bind. They were supposed to, and often needed, to look to the health visitors to support and help and encourage and advise them. But if they confided too much in the health visitors about their problems, many parents were terrified that their children would be taken away from them. And you could argue that that, to many people, is the highest stake in the world. Nothing matters more. Even losing your job, you can get another one sometime. But having your children taken away is incalculable. And therefore, the term stakeholders can be rather an unhelpful gloss. Then there's the question of how inequalities, where the health visitors are quite low often in the hierarchical chain, unfortunately, they're not given as much respect and support as they often need. But the parents, particularly the parents with problems, are much lower in the social scale. And how does that affect research and practice? Say I went in as a sociologist to interview them all. How honest would they be to me? How much would they trust me and dare to confide in me? How much might my research be twisted by how they felt they had to construct their accounts? And I expect many of you are working with the idea of epistemic injustice. It's a fantastic concept. Because it's not a critical realist one, I won't go into it now. But if you do want to know more, I'll send some follow-up information. But epistemic injustice is about the hierarchy of knowledge and status and how it affects our thinking and our talking and our policies and all our lives. Next slide, please. So can we have value-free apolitical research? Much health research is funded and planned by the government. I work in the largest social research institute in the UK. Most people in our huge department are scientific realists, and they get massive government grants, and they work very closely with the government. But does that mean they do not want to come up with findings that might offend the government? Do they go for functionalism? The type of sociology that is about helping present systems to function more efficiently, accepting the system and making it better. In contrast, critical research and critical realism, the word critical, by the way, is in the Marxist tradition of being critical of society and wanting to change the world and alter present injustices and inequalities, because these increase physical and mental illness. For example, at the moment, we've got austerity, policies to privatise the NHS, to reduce benefits for sick and disabled people, to cut much health-related spending. How much realistic evaluation work is being done on this? Or do the methods, systems and traditions in realist evaluation sort of step aside from these politics because they involve values? Also, randomized controlled trials are very important in scientific realism, but by their very nature, they randomize individuals or very small groups, and they examine how to change their beliefs and behaviors. And they may end up blaming overweight people for not losing weight, for example. RCTs do not critically examine groups and structures that are too large to randomize. For example, government policies or big food, big drinks companies, city planning, and many other powerful influences. But these hugely promote health or illness and need to be critically evaluated and compared. So I would argue that in social research, and particularly health research, it's not possible to be value free. We'd all say, yes, we want to promote health. Well, that's the value. And next slide, please. Right, discussion time.
It helps if you turn your microphone off if you want to speak. I find that's usually good for the audience. Otherwise, I'm just talking to myself and the dogs. So we've got Sue Skidmore, who's put a comment in the chat. And as an implementation researcher, I can relate to this. I was really struggled in my early days. Sue, do you want to ask your question, or I can ask it for you? I'll just wait a few seconds and see if you want to come on, because there might be further up in conversation that you can have, which might help even further.
Yeah, it's not a question as such. It's more an observation that I looked at critical realism when I did my PhD, and a lot of the headlines and the essence of it really resonated. But the more I started to dig, the more that I could see myself in a Viva having lots of different opinions, and I just found it really hard to bring it back to that coalface, not quite so what, that's a bit harsh, but how do we actually do this in a way that I can be confident? So I'm in a research and an implementation science in a couple of roles at the minute in both of these areas. I like the bullet points of what critical realism is, but I still struggle to say, how do we actually apply it in a real world context, which is slightly ironic since reality and real world is exactly what it all centres around. But I struggle to engage or understand the process of implementing it, if you like.
Oh, yes. One thing about the real world, of course, is getting funding for our research. And the funders, in fact, the government has keen on privatising, isn't it? But it's sort of nationalised academic research, because nearly all our funding now comes from research councils, government-run, organised, and research government departments, because they give up to 100% overheads. Years ago, we used to get most of our funding from charities, which were very interested in unusual questions and ideas about changing the world. and it was such a joy to work with them. But then I was told I couldn't apply anymore because they won't give overheads. So the real world is making critical research very, very difficult. And also, though, I'm not sure about complexity, because I would have thought that realist evaluation does plenty on complexity. And like both of us, critical realists and realist evaluators are rather fed up with the main journals that have such very short word totals for their peer-reviewed articles, don't they? Goodness, I've written 10 papers from our latest project, and the number of rejections we've had, mainly for small minor reasons, but it was clear that the peer reviewers, especially the American ones, didn't like our work because it was too innovative and challenging. And the other problem about these very short journal articles is as if knowledge is a brick wall, and you say, this is the brick wall, I've done my literature review, and here's my little brick in the wall, and that fits the short article. But if you want to say, look, the wall is all wrong, we need to bring it down and start building another one, and this is what it would look like, and then these are my findings, you can't possibly put that into 2,500 words, can you? So that the very shortness of these peer-reviewed journals, again, is a great pressure to be functionalist, to join the crowd.
Yeah, I think journal publishing is always going to be a contentious topic that we upload lots and lots in supplemental material, so that's one way of potentially doing that, because then you can direct people to additional parts of it. But whilst we've got a couple of questions there, but I just wanted to pick up again, I suppose it's around the slide. I think you said that realist evaluators tend not to do the particular areas of research, but I think it comes back to what you've just said, which is what's fundable. And I think, when there are particular funding calls out there, we have to, we can only research what we're funded to research. And I think that's an element. And I don't know how you address that. I don't know if we have any people who are part of like funding panels and how they come up with their topics, because that would probably be an interesting discussion as well. So I think we've got a comment by Sarah again, who's still in the library. I don't know if she wants to say it or not, so I'll waffle for a minute and you can butt in, Sarah. But yeah, I think it's the same thing, really, isn't it? There is realist researchers vying for social change in global health practice, but constrained by donor funding. And she's just said no, so she doesn't want to say. So no with an exclamation mark, definitely not. I don't know if anyone else has anything else they would like to add to this, because I think funding is a particularly tricky issue for all of us, because we have to go with what's available. Ray's got his hand up.
I can't really help on funding, and I'm just so glad that I'm not in that wretched anymore. I disagree with Priscilla. I think I'd stand by the primary objective of realist evaluation, realist research, which is to try as damned hard as possible to be objective, to strive for objectivity. So I've made no apology. That's the primary aim of social science as I see it, and I'm not very apologetic about some of the projects that follow from that. Very pragmatic questions. How can we reduce waiting lists? How can we cut down hospital infections? They seem to me valuable projects. I also disagree on whether there are any realist evaluation projects that tackle rather large and profound and value surrounded projects. I mean, I did some work on banning smoking in cars carrying children. Of course, I wanted such a ban, but the question is, would the various powers, would the various stakeholders involved allow that to happen, and in what respect would they allow it to happen? And I'm still worried that value-laden inquiry basically gets the answers that it wanted to begin with.
Thank you very much, Ray. First of all, I think we completely agree that research should be as objective as we possibly can be. It depends what you mean by objective. To be objective is to be open-minded, to look at all the evidence fairly, not to fudge things and leave them out because they're uncomfortable and difficult, and so on. We could make a long list of the important standards that researchers should have on objectivity. The big question is whether objectivity means value-free and whether it can mean value-free. I would argue that none of us are value-free. We all think that research should be as honest as it should be, as positive and helping to promote the public good. These are values. And we also think about respecting our scientific colleagues, listening to them, making the most of disagreements to learn from them. All of these things are values. Values pervade our entire lives. So to pretend that we can somehow be value-free when we do research is, I would argue, an illusion. Also, research on waiting lists. The main answer, how do we reduce hospital waiting lists, is alter the NHS budget. And to pretend that there are other ways. Of course, there could be more efficiency and effectiveness, yes, but those are minor at the moment. And it comes back to whether we are functionalist and go along with the present government's policy and way of running the world and help them to do it more efficiently or less harmfully, which is important, or whether we say the way the government is running the health services at the moment is wrong and it should change, and to take the critical view rather than, oh, it's very bad, but can we help to make it a little bit less awful? That is a value, but it's trying to pretend that it's value free when actually it's value laden.
I don't really agree. Again, if you say the problem is funding, you then have to come up with a design, a program, an alternative way of funding, and that requires research rather than just saying, from my critical perspective, it's foul, horrible, disgusting.
In real terms, the funding has gone down and down over the last 13 years. You can just, there are plenty of historical and political documents around that make this point and give all the evidence. It doesn't need more research, it's very obvious. Are you supporting the present government?
Good grief. How low can you go?
So I think we'll steer clear of politics in this in the last few minutes. But I think it's an interesting concept around values, but surely I'm just trying to think of how because let's face it, we've got a lot of PhD students in this forum today. How can they address that? And that's by putting elements of reflexivity into their thesis, isn't it? And by acknowledging their viewpoints and their standpoints from where they come from or their own values.
Yes, and critical realists would argue that it's very important to collect the whole range of related moral values and report them fairly and objectively, but that in the end, in the conclusion, that it is appropriate and maybe responsible of researchers to make some value judgments in the end and say there are fallacies or there are weaknesses or there are power imbalances or self-interest. There are lots of reasons why some arguments are less powerful and helpful than others, and that it's our responsibility to point this out. So
would you say that, from what you understand, and maybe Ray could answer this as well, that that element of understanding the role that values have in research has a greater emphasis in critical realism than it does in scientific realism. Ray, would you agree with that? You could nod or shake or add or.
By the way, I've got to leave in a minute because it's my turn at the school gates. Different researchers are going to pursue different theories, possibly backed by different values. But where truth emerges is in the clash of those theories, in the ability to adjudicate between theories rather than just saying, I'm sorry, I've got these values and that's what they are. I think that's an appropriate point for me to
thank you. Thank you very much, Ray.
Okay, bye.
Enjoy the school run. Thank you. So I think Fern's also asked, aren't we also exploring that the lower level CMOCs though? So for me, when I did my research, we certainly have an overarching program theory which helps explain, and you can think of that as a hypothesis, but then underneath that there are the more explanatory CMOCs which add like the nuts and bolts, and that's really where the details contained, where you will get elements of that generative causation. How does that map on to a critical realist way of presenting the data?
I'm sorry, there was a word I didn't catch. Was it CMOCs or something?
Yeah, context, mechanism, outcome, configuration. Sorry.
Oh, I see. I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I don't know. Would other people like to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy to open this up because we've got about 10 minutes left before the end of the session, and I do need to head off on time today because I've got to take my daughter to the hospital.
We've got 10 minutes. Oh, right. Well, I would love to discuss that, but would you like to have I've got a couple more things to cover. Would you like me to cover them, Jo?
Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Shall I do that?
Sorry, just coughing.
So could I have the next slide then? Thanks. I just thought I'd put a thing for my book, and I managed to persuade Policy Press to give a 50% discount for this month. Someone's kindly mentioned it, and it does have a summary of Ray Pawson and Sam Porter's debate in it at some length, with quite a lot of added comments and so on. And it goes into a lot more detail, say, about structure and agency and values and so on. Could I have the and also if you have to order it from Policy Press, and if you put the code BUP23 in, you'll get the discount. Or you could persuade your university library maybe to order it. Could I have the next slide, please? So absence, taking it seriously, absence is the positive, the present, the evidence is a tiny but important ripple on the surface of a sea of negativity. All that ever was or will be or isn't here or might have been or might be is so enormous compared with the tiny present. And so absence helps us to think about possibility, uncertainty, movement, emergence, and transformative change. And Jo, would you like to send the PowerPoint round to people after they're very welcome to have a copy. And could I have the next slide, please? So this need for transformative change over time in 4 stages that critical realism analyses. Now, most policies stop at stage 2. So you've got this policy, stop the boats, stop knife crime, build the wall. They don't work, do they? And what do the politicians do? Repeat and repeat. And that shows the importance of this 4-stage analysis. So next slide, please. Stage 1 is non-identity, absence, avoiding the epistemic fallacy. So you stand back, suspend stereotypes and values at the moment, try to grasp reality, ontology, look at many interacting causal mechanisms. Think about what is missing. Non-identity means don't impose meaning, search for it. So you've got this huge problem, for instance, of the rising incidence of type 2 diabetes. Whatever the problem is, this is the background researching and thinking. And you do it in your PhD, of course. Next slide, please. is intervention. Recognise the absence, the need, the suffering, the contradiction, the missing absent care, and intervene. And it's put in negative terms in critical realism, negations, absent absences, so that where there's missing in things in care, or things that aren't working well, or things that are needed, then you try to fill in the gaps or alter the problems. And this is your intervention and data collecting stage in your PhD, for example. Next slide, please. Then you stand back again and look at the bigger picture, open totalities. So you observe the interventions, maybe in longitudinal research, you've done action research, you've done an intervention and you observe what's happened and their effects, but you look at the bigger picture, the whole person, family, community, state, culture, globalization. You look at political and economic context, perhaps. You look at power too. And also, if you're doing a small, fast project, you nest your own data, your findings inside this bigger picture in your literature review, for example, and then you can refer to it. So even a small study can take the very big picture. Next slide, please. Stage 4 is praxis, practical change, implementing research findings. But that includes changing ourselves, transformative agency, and power one. Power one is creative, liberating power, working towards freedom, solidarity, and justice. So it's about movement and change, new self-awareness, everyone working consciously and intentionally together for real change. And then, using the new insights, you can return to one and repeat the virtuous cycle. And I would argue that every doctor and nurse, every time they see a patient, they go through this. They look at the notes, don't they? They discuss the problem and an intervention. At the time or later on, they review how successful or ineffective it was. And then if they've got time, they think, what have I learned? And how can I use that next time with the next patient? And again, with this patient in the future. And I would argue that we actually use this 4-stage cycle all through our everyday lives, but may not notice it. But I just think it's such a valuable, helpful thing to be aware of. In the next 2 slides, I've shown the negative one, where everything goes wrong. Would you like to show the next slide, please? But I'm not going to go through them in detail. Would you like to skip through to the third? Miss this one and then miss the next one. Thank you. And then this one. Someone said that sociologists are all like soloists, all playing a different tune. Why can't we work together? And I was hoping that maybe this session would bring critical realism and scientific realism a bit closer together, because what we need is a coherent, critical, practical public sociology, don't we? Were you shocked during the COVID pandemic that sociology was missing? We heard from economics and psychology and politics, but we didn't hear from sociology, which is so much needed. So can we work together to address the huge problems and collaborate more, and also raise our profile in the mass media and the public debate? And I think realist evaluation is ahead of critical realism by leagues in getting the attention of policymakers and the public much more than we do. But maybe we could work together more. Shall I stop there? Because there are a few more slides which I won't do now, but one is Douglas Papora's idea of 7 commitments that we could all sort of sign up to. Did you want any discussion, Jo, or did you want to?
Yeah, so there's literally, I think, one question. There's lots of people who've had to go because they've got other meetings, but we've just got a couple of minutes left. And it's Verity who's asked, she says she needs a bit of help to understand how to go from the critical to making change. And perhaps that's why scientific realism and realist evaluation is tempting, because it offers that limited functionalist change. And I guess that then you know, fits in, I suppose, with the funding and what you were saying earlier about the values bit. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what you think of that.
Yeah, well, 50 years ago, I got involved in a campaign to let parents into hospitals. We were banned from hospitals. We could only visit an hour a day or an hour a week when our children were in hospital in those days. So we set up a national organisation, and we campaigned and lobbied and wrote leaflets and designed posters and went to negotiate with staff. We did dozens and dozens of things. We were activists, and change massively occurred. And for 30 years, I've been researching consent to surgery and the change of the respect of doctors for patients, the way they inform them and listen to them and learn from them has absolutely transformed. So I'd say time is one of the answers, wouldn't you, Jo? But also many activities which busy academic sociologists just don't have time for. So we have to find colleagues in the NGOs, I think, and inform them and help them. The last chapter of my book is about this, how to connect our work into the public sphere and work for change.
And then we have one more comment, which is from Julie, which is, do you have any thoughts about the use of critical realism with the MRC framework? This is the MRC framework for complex interventions, is it, Julie?
Again, I think there are lots of people attending who know a lot more than I do about how to answer that.
If anyone wants to help Julie out, stick a reply in the chat. And then again, the last one is just thank you very much. So we've got seconds to spare. So in our true tradition, if everyone can, cameras on, mics on, and let's give Priscilla a round of applause. And we thank you very much for coming and giving this presentation today. Thank you very much. We've even got some people who've worked. I don't know how you do this, like clapping hands thing on Teams. You think I would? I go from back-to-back meetings every day, but maybe that just demonstrates the quality of my meetings, that I don't need to clap my colleagues. If someone can show me how to do that. Look, you're all doing it now. So, Karen, you got your hand up? No. So if anyone has any questions, you can hang on for a couple of seconds, but otherwise we're going to say goodbye. Thank you very much. If anyone has any burning topics that you would like us to do, then please email us realisthub@aston.ac.uk and we'll try and see if we can find a speaker for you. Karen, do you want to just tell everyone who's still around what the next one's about?
We're discipline hopping for the next one. So we're looking at how realist evaluations have been used within organisational research to evaluate organisational level intervention. So it's going to be Professor Karina Nielsen from Sheffield University, who's going to talk about her extensive work that she's done in realist evaluation, and she's definitely one of the shining stars within business and management using this method. So she's going to talk through some of her decisions and how she uses it in her work. So it'd be great to have a different voice outside of health, doing things in a slightly different way.
And I know that there are a lot of people in health who are now leaning towards organisational psychology, sort of like frameworks, things to be able to analyse the healthcare environment. So I think this will be an interesting crossover. The reason we're not advertising it today is as we've got this obviously problem with Eventbrite, we're trying to find a solution, a free solution to organise these events. If anyone knows of anything out there that can help us with the management of this, because sending over 100 emails and then people going, I don't have a link, it's just something we don't have the capacity to keep doing. So if anyone knows anything that basically is Eventbrite but still free, can you let us know? That would be great. Thank you. And we'll just stay on for a few minutes as we say goodbye to everybody. So thank you very much for turning in. We really appreciate it. And people are just starting to disappear. Sometimes I find people end up left.
Jo, is it possible to send a recording of the chat so I can have a look at the comments, because I didn't see them?
I'll try. I don't know is the honest answer to that. I think I've tried sharing the chat before. It doesn't always work very well.
Oh, never mind.
I will try. Well, I mean, we'll be extracting all of the recommendations for books and papers and things as well, because I'm hoping that will provide a useful resource for people. I certainly struggled. I like the work of Dave Eldervass. I found him quite accessible when I first started it, but even then I had to read it several times because it was all a new territory to me at the time, really, really new, and that makes it harder, I think.
Yes, it's like learning a new language, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so, and some of it may as well have been written in ancient Greek for me, so. Oh, Kate, you got your hand up.
Hi, yeah, no, thank you, Joe, for organising it, and Priscilla, thank you so much. And I'm really kind of pleased to meet you, because when I read your book, I felt like a light go on, because I'm in a medical school, but I'm actually from a humanities background, and so the sort of drive towards functionalism and positivism is very strong within the culture of that organisation, and my resistance is quite difficult to resist that, because I'm just a PhD student, but with a lifetime of clinical practice behind me. And I've been thinking about whether I can satisfy everybody and do like a realist review and realist evaluation, but within the critical realist embrace. Do you think that's possible?
Interesting. That's interesting. Well, just be careful about making your life really complicated.
But it is complicated. I mean, everyone says to me, oh, don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. But the trouble is once you start seeing the levels, the way that structure and agency works, and once you, I mean, I've completely changed my thinking, because I'm becoming a critical realist in my thinking, with no sociological training or anything. I mean, it changes your worldview. You can't unsee what you've seen.
So then maybe you've already moved. Maybe you're doing like Pawson and Tilley, scientific realism anymore. Maybe you've already moved.
Yeah, but
it's I can't stop seeing the world in CMOs now. That's how I do it. So, and you're right, you can't, because I even see my private life in CMOs. So I think, if you've moved, maybe that's like okay.
And I suppose I mean, maybe I was just going to say that maybe that's just something that you write in your PhD. I started thinking like this because that's what they told me to do. Read Pawson, do that. Didn't really understand it. Didn't really understand anything until I actually read Bhaskar, weirdly, and then found Mary Archer, and then Priscilla's book put it all into kind of perspective for me in a nice sort of much neater way. And I suppose, it's like, it is a gut thing. It is I agree with you, Priscilla, about values. I think they are absolutely implicit and core to our very being, and you can't escape them as much as you'd like to. It's a kind of arrogance, I think. Anyway, but
just if you're going to do it, I mean, I don't know, Priscilla, you probably have more experience with the PhD students than I have, but PhDs are evolving and you're on a journey of learning. So I think you would reflect on that and say, I started here but realized that I really needed to be here, and then move and just have a section that explains how you came from that starting point to where you ended up. That's how I would tackle it. I wouldn't try and erase what you did or those early thinking, because it's part of your learning and your journey, and you've been open to something that you didn't know existed, and now you don't. I don't know you, Priscilla, what would you advise?
Also, may I say that we recorded our 10 session course. It's on YouTube, which is this talk in 10 2-hour sessions. So shall I send you the link, Jo?
Yeah, because we can put that out with the links of other stuff.